Sanctuaries ought to be the places where we can find sanctuary from the burdens and the fears that weigh on us, and here we can discover glimmers of newfound hope. Synagogue communities ought to be a little more patient, a little more compassionate, a little more kind than out there. And the pastoral care that rabbis and cantors can offer can be an important complement to the medical and other professional care that people might seek. We can be good listeners in a synagogue community, and we can help to tap into the stores of Jewish wisdom and Jewish strength. For example, our Torah scroll is now set to Parashat Pekudei. This week's Torah portion includes the telling of how the ancient Israelites completed the building of the sanctuary, the Mishkan, that portable tabernacle that we carry with us throughout the desert wanderings. And at the center of that sanctuary was the Kodesh HaKodoshim, the Holy of Holies. And at the center of the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And contained within the Ark of the Covenant were the stone tablets with the Ten Commandments written upon them. And not only the second set of tablets, the ones that were whole, but also the first set. You remember the ones that were broken. Both the whole and the broken were placed together inside the Ark of the Covenant. Both the whole and the broken were carried dutifully, lovingly by the Levites, carrying the weight of them on their shoulders throughout the wilderness wanderings. Both the whole and the broken were treated as sacred. And so it is with people too. Every human being is a little bit whole and a little bit broken. Every human being is a sacred vessel for a spark of the divine. Each one of us created in the image of God. Our Torah portion is the last of the book of Exodus. The custom is that when we close off a book of Torah, in order to celebrate and to fortify one another and to rededicate ourselves to learning and to one another, we say three words: Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, and let us strengthen one another. Each one of us has come tonight with a unique story, a unique life experience, a unique prayer. For one reason or another, we have found our way to this sanctuary tonight. So let us create a sanctuary for one another, each in our own unique combinations of wholeness and brokenness. Let us share in our common humanity and in our common hope. And so I invite you to repeat after me: Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, be strong, and let us strengthen one another. Amen. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If at any point during the evening you might feel that you would benefit from the support of a professional therapist, there is a little new life cycle room just outside this door. And it's a quiet space where trained therapists will be waiting for you, ready to receive you, to listen, or just to sit quietly together. When it comes time for a question and answer at the end of our keynote speaker, the system is called Slido, and there are instructions on the screen behind me about how to use it. So at any point during the evening, if you have a question you'd like to pose, you can just follow those instructions and send it through your phone, and it will be received magically somehow. And if you don't have a phone, or if you don't like Slido, we can do the old-fashioned thing with cards and pencils. So you can just raise your hand, and you'll see an usher walking the aisles, and we'll make sure to pick up your good question. The washrooms can be found tonight at Holy Blossom Temple, we are very proud to be launching the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative. Luke was a blessing to our congregation. He was generous with his time and with his professional talents. He made us stronger when our congregation was struggling. He helped us find our way when we feared we were directionless. He shared his energy and his many gifts just when we needed him most. I know there are many friends and colleagues here tonight, and I know you miss Luke very much. I hope that being here tonight and speaking his name and hearing his good name will bring you some measure of comfort. We are especially blessed by the presence of two of Luke's beautiful daughters, Rebecca and Naomi. And the third beautiful daughter is with us remotely. Kira is on the other side of the planet, but she's with us in spirit tonight. And none of this evening would have come to be without the courage of Luke's wife, Lise Sklar. It is with her permission and with her blessing that the Holy Blossom community was able to turn our mourning for Luke into meaning. Lise, we are in awe of your graceful strength, and we are grateful for your leadership. So please come and share your reflections with us now.
Thank you everybody for coming. I'm so proud to be part of the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative at Holy Blossom. As many of you know, Luke died this past May 12th, 8 days before what would have been our 34th wedding anniversary and 15 days before he would have turned 63. It was far too young and it was far too soon. I wanted to talk to you tonight to give you a bit of background about who Luke was, and then share some of our experiences with the mental health challenges he faced. I'll also try to explain our reason for telling you the story. To begin, Luke was born in Toronto in 1955. He was the youngest of 3 boys, a beautiful blonde, curly-haired boy who his parents called their cheerful earful. He was an outgoing, energetic, athletic, and charismatic child who it seems was involved in and eager to learn everything. He went to Sunday school and later taught there. He had paper route and explained that as the reason he could never sleep in past 5:30 a.m. And he stocked shelves at the local Shoppers Drug Mart. His parents loved to travel and often took Luke along. His father had been an Olympic athlete, and Luke was very athletic himself. He loved tennis and played lacrosse as goalie in high school. As a young adult, he also played hockey, also was goalie several nights a week. I grew up in Montreal and met Luke when he was 28. Whenever we ran into people he knew, which to me seemed like all the time, I learned things about him. I learned that as a kid, he loved to sing and perform and was always the lead in camp musicals. He also liked to draw. He probably inherited this from both his parents, as his dad was a talented furniture designer and his mom had a creative flair that she expressed in her travels, cooking, clothing, and friends. Luke told me he had wanted to be a history professor, but his parents had convinced him that a business degree made more sense. He went to the Ivy School of Business, where he was on the dean's list. Following jobs in marketing, advertising, and market research, Luke started his own firm, ever an entrepreneur at heart. He began working at our kitchen table, but eventually decided he needed office space after telling me that our cats were destroying his documents. 2 clients followed him, and that was the start of Sklar Bolton & Associates, still a well-respected and successful market research firm, 30-plus years later. Luke's clients came by word of mouth based on the quality of work he did. He was creative, smart, dedicated, energetic, enthusiastic, motivating, and kind. David Rosenberg, who is on the committee, this committee, and a partner and chief creative officer at Sonic, and unfortunately is sick with flu tonight, recently told me about his first meeting with Luke. He said that it was 1999, and he, as a creative guy, walked into a meeting for a mutual client, not too excited to be meeting their market research guy. By the end of the meeting, he was asking himself, who is this person? Luke displayed intelligence, energy, and infectious enthusiasm. And that was Luke. His mother sometimes told him he was charming and lucky. That bothered him, because while he may have had charm, he also had an incredible work ethic, and he firmly believed that if you pursued your passion, success would follow. His goal in business was to help others succeed, regardless of whether they were a junior just starting out or the president of the company. Eventually, those juniors grew up, and many became presidents, always trusting Luke's willingness to listen and offer sound and honest advice. And that's how his business grew. As some of his partners are here tonight, I'm sure he wanted to say he couldn't have done any of it without them. Luke had his first bout of depression when he was turning 45. Our 3 daughters were 10, 8, and 5 years old, and to be honest, I don't remember that period so well. It started with a panic attack and then trouble sleeping. He took about a week off work, found a psychiatrist who could help him. After 1 or 2 drug trials, found some meds that worked. Read everything on depression he could get his hands on, and as I recall, was back to his old self before too long. He remained the goofy, gushing, felling dad he'd always been. He continued to build his business, we continued to raise our kids, we always had a household with animals, and life went on. We, or at least I, forgot about the profession for the next 15 years. But depression reared its ugly head again in May of 2015. Luke was turning 60, and we went on a lovely bike trip in Napa Valley to celebrate. But he was starting to have trouble sleeping and went back to the doctor who had seen him years earlier. A month later, we were at my nephew's wedding in Washington State, and Luke's depression was already severe. By August, he was tearful, had no appetite, was not sleeping at all, couldn't concentrate, and had a constant feeling of dread. He said he needed a cocoon of safety, so I drove him down to CAMH, where he was admitted for what ended up being almost a 2-month stay. While Luke was in CAMH, he learned that he was being inducted into the American Marketing Association's Marketing Hall of Legends for his lifetime contributions to the marketing community. The catch was that Luke would physically need to be at the event to accept the award and give a speech. This is like receiving the Academy Awards in marketing, but Luke wasn't sure he would be well enough. In the end, shortly after being discharged from hospital, he did accept that award, but my husband, who had been the most charismatic speaker ever, had to work so hard to deliver that speech. He rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed for what would have been easy for him at other times. It was around that time that Luke and I became friendly with Michael Lansberg. And Michael's here today. Michael was thinking of starting what would become SIG, but we already knew him as someone who had been incredibly brave about speaking publicly about his personal experience with depression. Luke asked Michael if he should mention his own depression in the acceptance speech, and Michael said yes. Luke did, and that's when we, as a family, began to realize what a difference talking about depression could make. People were astounded that someone like Luke, such a positive and outgoing guy, could be depressed, and importantly, was willing to talk about it. And they started opening up to us about their personal or family member struggles with depression. Between May 2015 and May 2018, Luke tried different drug cocktails, had 3 inpatient hospitalizations, a consultation chair all day, let's go watch a movie. Luke, there's hope. We love you. You'll get through this. People say that caregivers need to learn self-care. I made sure to exercise and do things for myself, but I was home a lot and always in the evenings, as nights were most difficult for Luke. I myself went for therapy and drew on an incredible support network of family and friends who gave me the strength to be able to support Luke and our daughters. I've talked about Luke's success as a mentor, friend, and business person, and the reaction we received from people who only knew Luke as an outgoing, positive person. They couldn't reconcile their image of him with that of a depressed person. We learned that, like many other illnesses, depression doesn't discriminate. In his illness, Luke did not have the energy to speak with or meet with many people. What's interesting to me is that about a year before the onset of Luke's depression, he needed hip surgery, which he quickly recovered from. During that time, he received so many cards and flowers and email and notes from people wishing him well. But these same well wishers were noticeably absent throughout his depression. I don't know if they didn't know about it, were uncomfortable with it, or just didn't know what to say. The wonderful people at Goldbloom never forgot Luke, and in fact, they're about to host an event to help companies embrace best mental health practices in the workplace. Throughout his illness, they'd send notes and cards and check in with us, and I learned that it's important to check in regularly with those that are ill. When someone would ask Luke if he wanted a visit or a phone call, he'd usually say, "No thanks." He was always polite. Some never bothered again, but an email or message every now and then that didn't ask anything of Luke meant a lot. One of Luke's oldest and dearest friends made sure to plan walks with him. Another picked him up for breakfast. I'm sure that hardly any conversation went on during these interactions, but none was expected, and that was okay. In the end, despite trying his hardest, Luke couldn't protect himself from himself, and he took his life on May 12th. I believe that this was the outcome of his illness, the convergence of desperation and opportunity, and not in any way a rational choice in the way that healthy people think of making choices. In his obituary, we as a family decided to say that Luke had lost his battle with depression. We received anonymous letters from people telling us how brave we'd been to write those words. We received notes from people we know for years who told stories we'd never heard of dealing with depression or having a family member who had died by suicide. And we received incredible comfort from being part of the Holy Blossom family. I've been talking for a while, but I wanted to close with one final thought. After Luke died, several people asked, what's the point of talking about depression and telling people to get help if it made no difference for Luke? I had to think about that. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association's website, almost one half of those who feel they have suffered from depression or anxiety have never gone to see a doctor. Stigma or discrimination attached to mental illnesses presents a serious barrier, not only to diagnosis and treatment, but also to acceptance in the community. I'm going to repeat that first part. Almost one half of those suffering from depression or anxiety have never gone to see a doctor. Imagine if one half of those with broken bones were too ashamed to seek help to repair them. Imagine if one half of those with cancer were too embarrassed to tell their partners or workplaces that they needed to get treatment and take time off work. Not everyone with cancer will survive, but just imagine if one half of all those affected were too embarrassed to get the help they needed. So in answer to the question of what's the point of talking about depression and telling people to get help if it made no difference to Luke, we say it's tragic that Luke didn't make it. But if talking about Luke's depression and death means that even one more person will reach out for help, then we've made a difference. Depression, after all, is an illness, and we need to treat it like any other illness and make sure that we're a safe place for those dealing with it. Thank you.
Cheryl Lester,
member of the Lucas Mental Health Initiative Committee and Vice President of Membership at Holy Blessed Temple Board of Directors. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Goldbloom. Dr. Goldbloom was born in Montreal and raised in Quebec and Nova Scotia. He completed undergraduate studies at Harvard University and attended the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he obtained an MA in Physiological Sciences. He trained in medicine and psychiatry at McGill University and is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Dr. Goldbloom's activities have been widely recognized and awarded by his leaders and students. He is the editor of 2 textbooks in psychiatry and co-author with Dr. Peter Bryden of the best-selling book, How Can I Help? A Week in My Life as a Psychiatrist. Dr. Goldbloom maintains an active clinical and teaching role at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, where he serves as a senior medical advisor. He also served as vice chair and then chair of the board of the Mental Health Commission of Canada from 2007 to 2015. He's a member of the boards of the Graham Beck Foundation, JAP.org, and the CAMH Foundation. Dr. Goldbloom is also an officer of the Order of Canada, and I have to say a member of Holy Blessed Temple. Please welcome Dr. David Goldbloom.
Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here to assist in the launch of the Lucas Mental Health Initiative, although I think I have to say, after listening to Lisa's remarks, she told you the most important things I think you're going to remember tonight about that all too common experience of depression. I want to acknowledge the tragedy of the loss that led to the generation, not simply of tonight's event, but of the initiative that will follow. Because everything we know about how people learn is that it doesn't come from a single event, but it comes from a commitment to learning, to thinking, to acting in an ongoing way, not just on one single occasion. I'm going to ask you for a moment to park your political correctness, to suspend it just for a moment, and just shout out those phrases that you've heard used to describe somebody with a mental illness. And I'll say in advance, you would never use these terms yourselves, all right? But you've heard them from other people. And when I do this exercise with people, I have to work, there's no way they can surprise me. And I realize we're also in a house of worship, which may put some constraints on some of the vocabulary. Nevertheless, who will be courageous enough to shout out some of the terms used?
Get over it.
Get over it, sure. What else?
He's crazy.
He's crazy. Sorry?
Nutcase.
Nuts. Is that Nutsy, yeah. Others? Psycho. Loony. Yeah.
Suck it up, Buttercup.
Sorry?
Suck it up, Buttercup.
Suck it up, Buttercup, sure. Others? Lazy. Sorry? Sugar. Well, thank you for adding the cultural overlay. All right. Now, I want you to think, how many people in this audience know somebody who's experienced, at some point in their lives, cancer? Hands up. Virtually everyone. I want you to think about that person in your head right now and shout out some of the adjectives that you would use to describe that person. Brave. What else? Sorry? Courageous. Unlucky. Fighter. Okay. Let me stop there. I mean, this is an exercise we can do for some time. How many of you personally, in the context of your growing up your schooling, your neighborhood, your family, yourselves, your work colleagues know somebody who was affected by mental illness? Hands up. And how many of you, in that same set of contexts, know somebody who died by suicide? Hands up. Okay. Virtually everybody in this room. And I want you to think about the adjectives that get generated for somebody with mental illness versus the adjectives that get generated for someone with cancer. This is a reflection of the double burden that people feel when they experience a mental illness. It's not simply the debilitating symptoms of illness. It's the stigma, the shame, the secrecy, not only that they feel from others, but in many cases that they feel toward themselves, what we call self-stigma. We all incorporate the values that are reflected around us. Now, in terms of why I'm talking about this tonight, first and foremost, I was asked to. I don't normally walk up to the beam on Holy Blossom uninvited to, in fact, this is, I think, my first time at the Bema since my son Willie's bar mitzvah. And I pointed out to Andrew Meisner that my son was a very, very good singer with the Canadian Opera Company children's chorus. People were a little taken aback at the quality of the singing. And Andrew Meisner leaned over after we finished and he said, "Remember, this is my job." And Julie got the message. He was pretty scared. So I'm speaking because I was asked. I'm speaking because I'm a psychiatrist proud to work at CAMH, and because I'm a person like every one of you who has family members and friends who have struggled with mental illness. Because I've seen at close range, both personally and professionally, what mental illness and what stigma about mental illness do to the human experience. And that is exactly why I'm here today. Now, before I came up here, Rabbi Slansky asked if I had a lot of religious context to my talk today because we didn't want to overlap too much. I assured her I wasn't going to show her up in terms of knowledge. And that's a no-contest situation. But I did mention to her that among Jews there are studies looking at things like stigma among Jews around mental illness. And of course, there are many types of Jews in the world. And the one study that I came across recently looked at Orthodox versus non-Orthodox Jews and showed that the level of stigma around secrecy, around family, around marriage, and about the idea of treatment was much higher in Orthodox than non-Orthodox Jews. But when it came to actually getting help, no difference. Right? That people, when they are desperate, will be driven to seek help. Psychiatry and psychotherapy as disciplines were really founded by Jews, from Sigmund Freud all the way up to Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy. And in contrast to Christian Stoicism, Jews place a positive value on help seeking from experts, whether it's rabbis or doctors. And Jews don't believe in original sin. They believe that people are fundamentally good. Jews encourage introspection and self-knowledge. And maybe that's one of the reasons that we are disproportionately represented among people who seek help for mental illness. That being said, there are many among us who need help and who don't seek help, who sustain the secrecy, who sustain the shame. I want to take you back in history to the early 1800s, to a couple of famous people. The first one John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, the greatest English philosopher of the 19th century. And when he was 20 years old, he fell into his first depression in his otherwise long life. And he wrote as follows in his diary. It was in the autumn of 1826. I was in a dull state of nerves, such as everybody is occasionally liable to. Unsusceptible to enjoyment or pleasurable excitement. One of those moods where what is pleasure at other times becomes insipid or indifferent. Suppose that all the objects of your life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you were looking forward to could be completely effective at this very instant. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? And an irrepressible self-consciousness distinctly answered, no. At this my heart sank within me. The whole foundation on which my life was constructed fell down. I seemed to have nothing left to live for. At first I hoped the cloud would pass away by itself, but it did not. I carried it with me into all companies and all occupations. In vain I sought relief from my favorite books. I sought no comfort by speaking to others of what I felt. And yet advice, if I had known where to seek it, would have been most precious. The fountains of vanity and ambition seemed to have dried up within me. Neither selfish nor unselfish pleasures were pleasure to me. 2 lines of Coleridge were often in my thoughts, not at this time, but in a later period of the same mental malady, because, like for so many people, depression is a recurring illness in the case of John Stuart Mill. And he quoted Coleridge, who wrote, "Work without hope draws nectar in a sieve, and hope without object cannot live." And John Stuart Mill thought he could not possibly bear this for more than a year. But depression passed, as it sometimes does spontaneously for people. There was no treatment in 1826. And importantly, he went on to many phases of a rich and productive life in the history of the 19th century in Britain. I'm going to inch forward a little, about 25 years, to a lawyer, a successful lawyer, who wrote to his law partner the following letter. I'm now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would be not one cheerful face on earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. Again, this young man, he was young, had a spontaneous recovery after a number of months, although his parents had sent him to stay with cousins and said, keep him away from the edge of the river. He recovered, he resumed his legal career, and then he went into politics. The author of the letter was Abraham Lincoln. Now we flash forward 100 years, and I will get to the 21st century. But I think what I'm trying to do is make the point to you that this is not a new phenomenon. This is not a phenomenon of having all your material comforts or freedom from physical illnesses taken care of. This is a problem as age-old as humanity itself. So we flash forward another 100 years, and another politician writes a letter to another friend. And by the way, in the world of text and email and Twitter, we will have no such letters anymore. People don't take the time to express themselves in the way people did with pen and paper. And he wrote as follows: when I was young, for 2 or 3 years, the light faded out of the picture. I did my work, but Black Depression settled on me. It helped to talk to my wife about it. I don't like standing near the edge of a platform when an express train is passing through. I like to stand right back and, if possible, get a pillow between me and the train. And yet, I don't want to go out of the world at such moments. Is much known about Marie Charles. Charles was the recipient of a letter written in August 1944. Charles was Lord Moran in Britain, and the author of the letter was Winston Churchill at the height of the war, when he struggled recurrently with depression. So now I'm going to enter the 21st century, because times have changed. Those were very secret letters that would never have seen the light of day. About a decade ago, the very popular Premier of Western Australia, Jeff Gallop, went on national television in Australia, and he announced to the public, "It's my difficult duty today to inform you that I'm currently being treated for depression. Living with depression is a very debilitating experience that affects different people in different ways. It has certainly affected many aspects of my life. So much so that I sought expert help last week. My doctors advised me that with treatment, time, and rest, this illness is very curable. However, I cannot be certain how long I will need. I now need time to restore my health and well-being." And with that, he exited the political stage in Australia. He's now running a graduate faculty in Sydney. But the point was, he did not fall back on the popular political line, "I've decided to spend more time with my family." Most people go into politics to spend less time with their families. He was candid, and he was celebrated across Australia. Australia being a country that's about a decade ahead of Canada in terms of understanding, in terms of public awareness, in terms of support, in terms of stigma. We have a huge national catch-up to do to be like our cousins down under. But this is a non-partisan political issue. Stephen Harper gave a eulogy for his colleague Dave Backers, who was a parliamentarian. And he talked about this. He said, "Depression can strike the sturdiest of souls. It cares not how much you have achieved or how much you have to live for." And that is a really important message that he gave about depression. Bob Ray has written about the depression he struggled with as a young man when he was 24. And he said, "I woke up one morning with a deep sense of anxiety and depression that was debilitating for the better part of a year. At times, I could scarcely get moving through the day and found talking to anyone difficult." Now, for any of you who know Bob, the prospect of him finding talking to anyone difficult seems unfathomable. But depression does not select. Depression is random, and when it hits, it can hit hard. I'm not going to comment on any other American politicians, although if there's a Q&A and there's a prompt question, I will deal with it. But I want to say this, because stigma is an important part of what we need to talk about. My first exposure to stigma came in 1972. I was 18 years old, for those of you rapidly doing the math. And I was in my freshman year at Harvard, and all my roommates were very worried about being drafted and shipped to Vietnam. So we were all working very hard toward the defeat of Richard Nixon by working for the Democratic presidential nominee, George McGovern. I don't want to call myself a political rainmaker, but with my center, the lawyer, and the media discovered that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he had been successfully treated for depression with electroconvulsive therapy. He made a complete recovery. Within 24 hours, he was dropped by the Democratic Party as its vice presidential candidate. He was replaced with JFK's brother-in-law, Sergeant Schreiber. And I was, as an 18-year-old, gobsmacked. I didn't understand why somebody was punished for getting help and getting better. And I've argued ever since then that the only politicians you should actually worry about are the ones who haven't been treated. Now, you heard from Rabbi Splansky that it's 1 in 5 Canadians who experience some form of mental illness every year. And it's not the same 1 in 5 year over year. It keeps changing. So that statistic sometimes gets misinterpreted as 1 in 5 over the course of their lives. No, it's a different 1 in 5 every year. It's like they used to say that in Manhattan, every 11 seconds, a man is hit by a car, and people say, well, that guy should get out of town. Right? No, we're talking about different people. It costs our economy $51 billion a year. The impact of mental illness in our country. Every single day of the week, 500,000 Canadians are away from their jobs because of mental illness. And in Canada, we lose 3,800 Canadians every year to suicide. That is an enormous number, even though suicide is a rare event among the many people who experience mental illness. Mental illness is way more common than suicide. And if we look at young people between the ages of 15 and 24, suicide is the number 2 cause of death after accidents. We also know, quite apart from suicide, that the burden of suffering with mental illness is substantial. Indeed, here in Ontario, Public Health Ontario measured the burden, and it may seem almost obscene to try to quantify a burden. How do you measure loss? But we can measure years lived with a disability and years lost due to premature death, and put those two together and call that a burden of illness. And when they did that in Ontario, they compared 7 types of mental illness, including depression, with all types of cancer and all types of infectious diseases. And here's the blunt truth. The burden of those 7 mental illnesses was 1.5 times greater than all cancers combined in Ontario. And yet, we don't invest and we don't reach out as individuals, as families, as societies, and as governments to accommodate people the way we are. And I remind you that suicide is the leading cause of violent death worldwide, greater than homicide, greater than deaths in wars. We lose 800,000 people a year globally to suicide. In the Vietnam War, 54,000 young American men lost their lives between 1961 and 1973. In that same time period, over 100,000 young American men lost their lives to suicide. And that statistic is not spoken of. So let me say a little bit about what mental illness is and what it isn't. First of all, it's one of the commonest forms of human suffering in our society. And unlike those illnesses for which people run up and down the CN Tower or bicycle along the DVP, those are mainly illnesses of middle age and old age. Heart disease, kidney disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes. We all know of tragic cases involving young people, but they're mainly disorders of middle age and old age. By contrast, mental illnesses tend to hit people for the first time just as they're coming into their own sense of their personal identity and their professional identity. And as I said earlier, they carry that double burden of symptoms and stigma. In the main, mental illnesses are highly treatable if people are allowed to and able to get the help that they need. The difference is, for the people who have been successfully treated, they don't tend to talk about it. That is changing. There are people here tonight who are making some of that change happen, including my friend Michael Lansman. But lots and lots of people keep it quiet, keep it on the down low, that they've got good health. Whether it's for mental illness or substance use. Part of CAMH is what was formerly called the Donwood Institute in Leaside. And it's where people in Day Street used to quietly go for 3 weeks to get off alcohol or cocaine, and then get a spray on tan and say they were in the Bahamas for a couple of weeks while they got clean and sober. Let me say some things about what mental illness is not. It's not untreatable, it's not unavoidable, and it's certainly not contagious. And yet, people act as if it is. I didn't grow up in this city, but my friends who did tell me that when they took the 501 streetcar as kids, and it rumbled past 999, they would hold their breath because they didn't want to catch the fumes emanating from the asylum. And asylum has become a kind of dirty word. He's in the asylum. And yet what Rabbi Splansky talked about earlier was that this place is a kind of asylum. It's a sanctuary. And when you think about the political context of asylum, rather than the psychiatric context, what does it mean to seek asylum? It's to have your rights protected, to seek comfort and solace. That should happen here, and it should happen at the asylum where I happen to live. The hardest thing for a lot of people to understand is that an illness, a mental illness like depression, is not restricted to people who are in difficult circumstances. And indeed, people say, what have you got to be depressed about? I don't kill to have your job, your family, your house, your cottage, your car. They name any number of accoutrements of a successful life as if these are Kevlar against depression. They aren't. They can strike people in the most fortunate of circumstances, but it can often trigger a negative judgment by people who are envious or perplexed. Let me say things about depression itself. We all use the word, right? And it gets used loosely. It's a more sophisticated way for some people of saying they're upset or sad. Those are normal, universal human emotions. And look, I can tell you, I've seen over the course of 35 years countless numbers of people with depression. And the question I ask every single one of them is, tell me the difference for you between feeling sad and feeling depressed. And in a heartbeat, every single one of them knows the difference. They are profoundly different emotions. And yet, I confront the misunderstanding of what depression is all the time in public, including when I do a fair amount of media stuff. The time when I get at the worst is when I'm doing a sports radio interview. And they'll say, on the phone, they'll say, tell me, doctor, why are people so depressed about Maple Leafs? I have to explain the difference between being fed up or disappointed and being depressed. So that's the first misunderstanding. misunderstanding is thinking that it's purely a mood disorder, that it's purely a reflection of feeling down. It's a cognitive disorder. It's a brain disorder. And what does that translate into? Disruption in your concentration, your attention, your memory, your motivation, your decision-making. Think about the impact of that for those of you in the workplace when you show up for work. Everybody in our postmodern economy is valued not generally for their capacity to lift very heavy things. You know, probably most people in this audience don't strap on a hernia truss when they go to work because you're valued from the neck up. So imagine the impact if you have problems with your motivation, your attention, your memory, your concentration, your decision-making. Imagine the impact on the way you perform in the workplace. And then it disrupts those most fundamental aspects of our mammalian existence. Our ability to sleep and find it restorative. Our ability to eat, maintain our weight, and get pleasure from food. Our sexual drive, our social drive. And then people often find themselves in a vortex of negative thoughts. And that vortex of negative thoughts includes typically brooding about mistakes they made, feeling like they let themselves down, let other people down. And it's in that spiral, in that descent, that suddenly suicide tends to rear its head as a possibility. Almost always as an ambivalent possibility. Until the final moments when a whole group of things coalesce for that person to take that final step. And yet we know even then, people experience doubt and uncertainty. What causes depression? This is the shortest part of my talk. We don't know. We do not know. There are many theories, many schools of thought, but the honest answer is we do not know. Now, just to add to things, we do not know is the answer to what causes a huge number of medical illnesses. Okay? And the good news is that the history of medicine has always been that treatment and effective treatment has always leapfrogged ahead of understanding what causes illness. We had aspirin for 100 years before anybody had a clue how aspirin worked, but we had 100 years of it taking away people's aches and pains. We had digoxin for heart disease before anybody had a clue how it worked. Even some of our chemotherapies for cancer, we don't actually know because we don't know what causes lots of cancers. So there are many factors that come into play. The one thing you can't change, your family history. And indeed, because this is a common illness, it's not unusual that people have had people in their family who struggle with some kind of mental illness, like depression. And you know, I think we do our children a huge disservice when we don't talk to them openly about it. If your father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all had their first heart attack at age 35, you can be sure you'd be talking to your kids about it from an early age, telling them to eat a heart-smart diet and exercise and to do all the things that increase their sense of control over their genetic vulnerability. Because vulnerability is not destiny. There are lots of things that put us at risk. That doesn't make it a certainty. And yet, if your father, your father's brothers, and your grandfather all struggle with alcohol abuse, when do you start that conversation with your children, if ever? If your Uncle Louie was in the and need to start early. How do we treat depression? Well, fortunately, we have more than one form of effective treatment. There are a variety of antidepressants that have been around since the late 1950s. There is electroconvulsive therapy, which has been around since the late 1930s and remains our single most effective intervention in psychiatry, as well as newer forms of brain stimulation. And then there's also psychotherapy. And psychotherapy has proven itself to be an effective form of treatment for a variety of types of depression. But when I have seen people with depression and their families, the questions are always simple and important. What do I have? What's wrong with me? People need an explanation. This is a nonsensical experience, especially the first time it happens. The second time it's a little less nonsensical. People recognize that early warning sign that the illness has come up. Will I get better? That's the question all depressed people want to know. Although it's sometimes hard for families and for clinicians to convince that person that they will recover. I've always said you can't win an argument with a depressed person because their grip on negative thought is a tenacious. What should I do? What should I not do? Is it going to happen again? Do I need to take treatment indefinitely? And the ultimate question, why did this happen to me? And yet at the same time, there are voices around that person, all too often saying, why doesn't he just pull up his socks? What has he done to be depressed? He's just lazy. What are you going to do? That's the way he's always going to be. I don't want to be with him. He's such a downer. And so at a time when people most need support, people often back away. And that brings me to the subject of stigma. Now, I'm not sure exactly what time it is. Keep going. Okay. I saw our organizers a few minutes ago. I took a look over there. She was checking her watch. And just now she was checking her calendar. I do want to say something, though, on stigma. And my last skill testing question for the audience, how many of you saw the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding? Okay, just about everybody. So you will remember a couple of important things from that film. Nia Vardalovic's father, very proud Greek, although that is a redundant term, he believed, firstly, that Windex cured all skin lesions. He was always spraying his arms with Windex. But he also believed that every word in English came from Greek. Not exactly true, but stigma is one of those words that does come from Greek. And it refers to the person, or the bodily signs of a person, who is unusual, bad, blemished, morally polluted, to be avoided, especially in public places. And that's how stigma manifests today. And you know, we have stigma about mental illness in ways that would never be tolerated for any other form of human suffering, especially in our politically correct world. But the cartoons, and I could go on at length about the New Yorker cartoons that haven't changed in 50 years, that trivialize the experience of mental illness for people. And it's been around, it continues to this day. I work at CAMH that started life in 1850 as the Provincial Lunatic Asylum. That was its original name. And that was not a stigmatizing name at that time. People didn't know what to call people with mental illness. Phases of the moon explain it as well as everything else. So lunatic became the preferred term. Then they thought, ooh, 20 years later, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. They came up with another name, the Toronto Hospital for the Insane. And then years passed, they said, maybe we could tweak about what is now CAMH, and it was called At the Asylum, a visit to a great provincial institution. And this is another example of the way people no longer write. Insanity. Does not the word bring to the recollection of almost every reader some face, a friend, a relative perhaps, of one who, though living, is counted among the dead? What sad chapters in many a family history have been written and must be written to the end of time, bearing that terrible title, Insanity? Where is the mind so inflexible as to view undisturbed, or the heart so adamantine as to pass without sadness the tomb of the living dead? That's what my hospital was called in 1890, the tomb of the living dead. Now, we have modernized CAMH. It's a big, beautiful hospital. It's publicly supported now. Tremendous philanthropy and public awareness. But it's a 550-bed hospital that has no gift shop. It has no gift shop because it lacks the human traffic of visitors that supports the business model of a gift shop. You can go into the smallest hospital in cottage country up in Muskoka, and you won't get 20 yards in before an older lady in a blue smock wrestles you to the ground until you buy a stuffed animal, a get-well card, or flowers. Why? Because that's how we express a sense of support, community, and hope to people when they're ill enough that they need to be in the hospital. We don't have 550 orphans residing at CAMH. There needs to be a greater flow of people to support people when they struggle with mental illness. Now, I'm old and gray enough to have seen the changes that have occurred over the last 35 years. I used to remember patients when I worked at what was then the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, who would sort of come in a side door, darting in with a plastic or paper bag over their heads to avoid detection by somebody who might reveal that they were seeking help. Those times have changed. We recently lost one of our champions, Michael Wilson, who was so open about his son Cameron's struggle with depression and with suicide. I want to make sure I protect time for the Q&A, because this is a subject where I can actually just go on and on and on. But I want to leave you with some thoughts. First of all, that having a mental illness doesn't mean you cannot work. Most Canadians who have mental illness are in the workforce. They're not away from it. But we need to do a whole lot better job for the Canadians in the workforce of recognizing, supporting, and accommodating mental illness when it affects them. Because it's a huge cost. People say, do I need to see a psychiatrist? And I say, well, you don't need to start with a psychiatrist. The vast majority of people who experience mental illness in Canada will not be treated by psychiatrists. They will be treated first and foremost by their family doctors, and then by other mental health professionals, and sometimes by psychiatrists. In the same way that not everybody with high blood pressure sees a cardiologist, most people with depression do not see a psychiatrist. There's no blood test to make a diagnosis of depression. Wait lists are real. They're a national problem. But I can tell you, if you're referred for an assessment at CAMH now, the wait list for a general assessment is a couple of weeks. And the emergency room is open 24/7 for anyone who needs help. Doing nothing about this after tonight is, in my view, untenable. Leadership makes a huge difference. whether it's in workplaces, whether it's in schools, whether it's in houses of worship. The leaders set the example for the community. It's the right thing to do, and it's the smart thing to do. Finally, we often come full circle on things. The evolution of the treatment of melancholy began before the Christian era, around 2019, but in 2019 BCE, the treatment of melancholy, they said, eat this fruit, that should do it. But by 1000 in the Common Era, the Christian era, that root is for pagans. Say this prayer, that's going to get you better. By 1850, just really 170 years ago, people would say, well, you know what, drink this potion, that'll make a difference. And then by the 1920s, people were saying, that potion, that's not going to work, that's snake oil. Take this little nerve pill, that'll do the trick. And then science started to rear its head in psychiatry, and by the 1980s, people said those nerve pills are not effective. We have evidence-based antidepressants. And by 2019, we have people who are now saying, well, those antidepressants are artificial. Eat this root. I encourage you to take the wisdom that science has brought us, take the comfort and the support that spirituality brings us, and hold your friends and your family close when you or someone you care about encounters mental illness, because this is not a time to feel or to be alone. Thank you very much for your attention. Sure.
What can you do to support someone who refuses to get help?
So the question of what do you do when somebody says they don't want help? This is a really common scenario, so much so that I sent the organizers a link to a pamphlet that is actually specifically on this topic, and it's prepared at Camp Beach by the Family Resource Center. And the Family Resource Center is a place where people can go to get advice and support, even if their affected family member is refusing it. So I encourage you to take advantage of it. But more informally, what I would advise you to do is to be a pest. And I mean that in the best possible sense. People with depression, for instance, will often try to fend you off. I said, no, I'm fine, it's all right. And yet you know they're not all right. You know that this is not the person that you know to be when they're well. So you cannot accept the additional fending off. You've got to go back. You've got to find out who has leverage with them, who has their trust. And it is not going to be, in many cases, a one-off conversation. They're not going to say, gee, thank you so much, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I'll know it's to help me. Sometimes people will be, you'll catch them at that vulnerable moment where they say, you're right, I do need you. But very often they will fend you off. So there's some very practical tips in the pamphlet. There's lots of peer support, and I want to really put a big emphasis on peer support. This is a huge army in Canada of families who have been there, and their wisdom from their own experience is often way more valuable to families struggling with this for the first time than hearing from a raft of health professionals. And so that's where supportive communities, whether it's here it's often not a one-time conversation. You've got to be ready to go back and have it.
What does it mean to have been successfully treated? Is it successful if medication is ongoing?
Okay. So, I'm going to reveal one of the secrets of medicine for you. So you can please tell no one after you leave Holy Blossom. We don't cure a lot of things in this. We relieve symptoms a lot of the time. We minimize the intrusion of illnesses on people's functioning, on quality of life, and we try to prevent complications. But people who have diabetes, even if they're stable on their insulin, still have diabetes. People who have heart disease, whose blood pressure is well controlled, they still have heart disease. And people who have depression, when they are successfully treated, are free of those symptoms that can be so immobilizing and can often resume their lives. But does that mean they should go off their medication? No. We know that if you've had one episode of depression, your lifetime risk of a second one is about 50%. And if you've had 2 episodes, your lifetime risk of a third episode is well over 90%. So that we know that antidepressants play a role in preventing relapse, preventing recurrence. And now, I've seen people who've had depressive episodes separated by 20 or 30 years. That's a long time to go without an episode. And we know that there are various forms of treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressants, which can play a role in helping people to stay well. But is the thing that put you at risk for depression gone? Not to our knowledge. But we can do a good job of keeping it at bay. And that's really what most of medicine is about, is keeping things at bay. We've got a small number of cures. The 19th century physician Edwin Trudeau, who many people will not have heard of, his most famous claim to fame was he was the grandfather of Gary Trudeau, the creator of the Doonesbury comics. Edwin Trudeau ran a tuberculosis sanitarium in upstate New York. And he said that the role of the physician was to cure rarely, to relieve often, and to comfort always. And I think that's still true in the 21st century. That's what we do.
It seems difficult to access mental health care. Long waits for psychiatrists and psychologists who are quite expensive. What can we do to advocate for this to change?
Yeah, I really encourage you to make noise about this. Canada spends 7% of its health dollars on mental health. In the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, they spend between 11 and 13% of their health dollars on mental health. We woefully underspend in Canada. Now, simply throwing money at problems doesn't fix those problems. We have to radically redesign how we access care. We've been working pretty hard on this at CAMH. I mentioned to you that the waiting list for that initial assessment is now down to a couple of weeks, but it used to be way longer. There's an initiative on in Ontario, the Improving Access to Structured Psychotherapy Program, based on the British model. Right now in the United Kingdom, under the National Health Service, they provide rapid access to structured, evidence-based psychotherapy. Last year in the UK, they assessed 1 million people, and they don't even have to go publicly funded, it's publicly accountable, and the person who designed it 12 years ago is now consulting to the Ontario government about how to implement a similar model here. So change is in the wing, but unfortunately, that change doesn't come quickly enough for anyone who is in need. They are sailors drowning within sight of shore. And until the pressure is fully on at every level of government to do something, to improve services, it won't happen. We saw with cancer a huge investment. We saw with HIV a huge investment when the public began to make noise. And that same thing needs to happen for mental health.
I see so much of depression for children resulting from a lack of development of communication skills. With technology overwhelming us all, the ultimate loneliness of the net will make it worse. Any suggestions to combat this?
So this is, you're speaking to a guy who writes for the fountain pen, so I'm probably not the best source. But let's remember that every new wave of technology has triggered horror in the preceding generation. When telephones came into widespread use, people said, oh, God, this is the end of discourse as we know it. Instead of making eye contact, people are talking into a receiver. There are 5 billion cell phones on Earth. More people in India have cell phones than have their own toilets. This is not going away, and we need to leverage it positively. And in fact, I was at a conference on digital psychiatry, and there are really extraordinary things being done now to provide psychotherapy through artificial intelligence on apps on your telephone. So the access then becomes instantaneous. There's no waiting list. The second you need it, it's right there in your phone. So that's a bit of the future. That being said, I have also seen the undermining normal human discourse. I was stunned when I heard the rabbi say, you can send in a question on your phone. I've been terrified. I didn't have a phone on when I'm here. So times are changing. You can use your phone and show. But what I would say to you as adults and as parents, or maybe as grandparents, is how are you modeling behavior for your children? I'm a great proponent of the very simple, elegant, and evidence-based intervention that's called family dinners. All right? And let me tell you that there is research evidence on the impact of family dinners, comparing families of children who eat 5 or more family dinners together a week, compared to those children who eat 3 or fewer family dinners per week. And those 3 or fewer, that's the sequential grazing through the kitchen at night as each kid and each parent comes home at a different hour and grabs something to eat. And if you look at the data from Columbia University, for the high-frequency family dinners, those adolescents talk about being able to confide in their parents, being able to think that their parents are proud of them. They have later onset of substance use. They have lower rates of depression. They have higher self-esteem. So if you want a quick intervention that has no waiting list, commit to dining together as a family with high frequency, but make another commitment. Everybody turns to the phone. Right? Nobody is allowed to respond to their phone at the table. We've had this rule in our house for many years. We also don't answer our landline. That's how old we are. We have a landline. We don't answer the landline during meals because it's only a telemarketer, first of all. And you know that pause but the letters O, N, and B are all applied to the name, not necessarily a member. And I was speaking to a group of 50 wealth managers, and at the end of the talk, a woman, and they were mainly men, but a woman stood up, and she said, I wanted to say something to this group, because we had 90 minutes at that point talking about mental illness. She said, I have bipolar disorder, and I've been working here for 10 years. And 3 times in the last 10 years, I had to take a medical leave. And each time when I came back, not one of you sent me. Not one of you came up and said, how are you? What happened? She said, it wasn't a matter of confidentiality. I would have told you if you had asked me. And it would have meant so much to me if you had just asked me that simple question. How are you? What happened? And she was crying as she sat down. And then one by one, each of one of those wealth managers stood up and said, actually, my daughter has anorexia nervosa. My uncle has schizophrenia. My mother drank herself to death. And for each one of them, it was a personal experience and one that had been entirely undisclosed. And when I left them, because my work was done, they were all talking to each other. And they were all talking to each other about shared humanity. And I firmly believe that once that door is open, it's very hard to shut.
Hi, my name is Jill Wickton. I'm also a member of the LSMHI Mental Health Initiative Committee. I'm also on the board of directors for the Temple and vice president of Tikkun Olam in Israel. I'm also the organizer, I think, that Dr. Goldbloom was referring to, and I can assure you I was not looking at my watch. Dr. Goldbloom, I want to thank you so much for your informative and insightful and constructive words of wisdom. We all know that mental pain is less obvious and perhaps less dramatic than physical pain, but it certainly can be harder to bear. And as Lee said earlier, unbearable psychological pain is how it's described. And it must be even harder when people don't understand or assume that you can just get over it. So Dr. Goldbloom, you've generously donated your time and your expertise to help us recognize, to help us respond appropriately, to say the right thing, to do the right thing. For that we are grateful. As a token of our appreciation, we have a gift card for Dr. Goldbloom for Holy Ground, which is the cafe that will soon be opened here at the Temple. As you can see, the new space just opened on Friday. The cafe will be opened soon, and this is for Dr. Goldbloom to enjoy when he comes to Temple. I also just want to say, it takes a village, they say, to raise a child, and it also takes a committee to launch an initiative and to put on an event. I want to thank the committee members of the LSMHI initiative for their time and their expertise. From the synagogue, Rabbi Satz, Deanna Levy, Thomas Smith, and of course, Rabbi Slansky, for her support, encouragement, and wisdom. From the board, Cheryl Sylvester and Julie Solomon. From the membership of Holy Blossom, Doreen Saskin, David Rosenberg, and Shelley Grindelwald. Also thanks to Corinne Black and Jerry Pendergast for coordinating the readers and the ushers tonight. But most of all, I want to thank Lise for being a part of our committee, for sharing with us your honesty and your family's challenges and the memory of Luke. From this tragic event, we are learning from you. We want to continue to learn and to do better for our friends, our family, and our community. I want to let everybody know that the event tonight is just the start of this initiative. This is the kickoff event. But our goal is to continue to offer speakers and small group sessions to educate and offer support for our community and to continue to reduce the stigma.
We have other things going on as early as tonight. Tonight, the grade 6 and 7s have their first session of something called Brave Waves, which is an educational resiliency program for teens created by Holy Blossom member Sherry A. Sarvis. Starting tomorrow night, there will be a Tuesday night drop-in support group called Here to Help, and it's led by an addiction counselor from Jewish Addiction Community Services, aimed at parents with a child who is struggling with addiction, whether it be alcohol, drugs, gambling, or even technology. Starting in April, we're going to have a series of sessions called Mind-Body Connection. Those are sessions on mindfulness, anxiety, and depression with social worker from Jewish Family and Child Services. And starting in May, there's going to be a workshop called Finding Resiliency with our own committee member and social worker, Doreen Saxon. I heard Dr. Rosenberg talk about peer support, and I can tell you that on our committee, that's something else that we have started to talk about, a peer support group for people who have this. So check online for details. Also, there's going to be a reception afterwards downstairs, and there are information tables from Jewish Child Family Services with Jax and from Sharon Louise Arvis, and you can get more information there. Now, this initiative that we are involved in does rely on donations to be sustainable. If you would like to make a donation, whether big or small, to allow us to continue to put on this program, please go to the website and donate. You can do so in honor of a loved one or a friend. And in fact, as a gesture of our appreciation, our committee has donated very generously to the fund in Goldbloom. I want to just close by thanking everybody for coming tonight and for being part of this initiative. We do hope, if you can, to come downstairs at the bottom of the stairs. There's tea, coffee, cookies, and getting a chance to talk to everybody,